Take any article, any video, any social media post, or any coverage from the media, it always seems like there's a bit more to the story. As we've shown before, virtually every news subject to varying degrees has become political and has a set purpose. You have to wonder, how did the journalism industry go from its original purpose of informing the public and keeping political powers in check to becoming a strong political power in and of itself? Rather, how did we as a society become indifferent to the fact that news these days are less about reporting facts and more about plain activism? Well, as it turns out, not only does this phenomenon go back a very long time in history, it is also both an integral part of society and of our nature as humans. Let's look at the first reason. The first thing we need to understand about bias in media is that articles are written by people. These writers, editors, publishers each have their own views and agendas, and most often their agendas are executed consciously, as in the author will deliberately manipulate the facts in his writing to get the desired result. Other times the writer will deploy bias subconsciously, and will not even notice anything wrong. For instance, think of the difference between a journalist downplaying the crimes of one of the most infamous terrorists in modern history versus a journalist emphasizing every single possible detail of a mass shooter's life. Now, two good examples of this would be, first, this article from the Washington Post that referred to now dead ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as an austere religious scholar who's dead at 48, and that referred to him joining an insurgent group who carried out suicide bombings as a local resistance movement. Along with this second article from CNN, which focused on distant comments a mass shooter made on a controversial online forum. Now, a good example of subconscious bias, on the other hand, would be a journalist who defends a corrupt politician but then criticizes another politician for the same thing. This article from Reuters insists that allegations against Joe Biden threatening to hold up aid money for Ukraine unless they fire the prosecutor he wanted are unsubstantiated, whilst this Washington Post article firmly claims that there was a quid pro quo in the ongoing Trump situation, but cites relatively weak evidence. Aside from personal views and bias, it is important to take into account that the vast majority of journalists operate within set boundaries and are guided by external forces. These forces are usually the organization that employs the journalist, but can sometimes be simply peer pressure. We will get to the organization's part in just a second, but as far as peer pressure goes, it's understandably hard, if not impossible, to go against the crowd. Given all this, a journalist is unlikely to act any differently than his colleagues, his editors, and his boss. A simple example here would be the political leanings of the journalism industry. A 2014 study claimed that 7% of all journalists identified themselves as Republicans, and a 2018 study claimed that only 4% of all journalists identify themselves as somewhat or very conservative. We also know from both of these studies, and from public records, that the vast majority of journalists donated to Democrats in the previous elections. So keeping this in mind, we could expect most journalists to keep writing with a left-wing bias, and their conservative colleagues will be inclined to remain quiet and further contribute to the imbalanced reporting. Now on to the second reason. When we go one step higher above the journalists in the journalism industry, it is ultimately organizations who publish news content. These organizations are themselves made up of people, and so they inherit their values and biases on a much larger scale. Let's take the example in America. We notice that the news industry has been consolidated and merged to a point where 50 media companies merge into the same 6 conglomerates, most of whom are telecom companies, such as Comcast, Disney, and AT&T. These subsidiary media companies represent about 90% of all American news. The other 10% have little outside influence and are owned mostly by billionaires, such as Fox News by Rupert Murdoch, Washington Post by Jeff Bezos, and Bloomberg by Michael Bloomberg. The primary factor of any organization that is important to remember here is the importance of revenues to an organization. These revenues can either come in the form of sales or government subsidies. In the United States, most media organizations are for-profit corporations, and they are required to cover what sells the most. This has started a worrying trend in the industry, what many refer to as media commercialism. It is the phenomenon where journalists are told to focus only on the sensational and catchy headlines, and thus, they ignore the higher value of more important reporting. One great example of this is the obsessive covering of Trump's social media, where every second tweet gets a full 15-minute segment on TV. Although this is much more common in Canada and Europe, the US has a few examples of publicly funded broadcasters of its own, such as PBS and NPR. The business model of these organizations abides by different rules that includes friendships with politicians and lobbyists that in turn secure rounds of funding. If a political party dares to suggest a cut in funding, they become the target of attacks from these reporters. Such was the case in the 2012 election, where Republican candidate Mitt Romney threatened to eliminate PBS's government funding. Other examples include politicians in Canada and the United Kingdom who made headlines after suggesting the CBC's and BBC's funding should be cut, respectively. And of course, moving on from the financial motivation, there is the ideological one. Most news organizations, just like the people operating them, have ties to political parties and movements. They can either support a movement by providing donations through positive coverage or holding back from negative coverage. We see this with most left-wing news outlets who support Planned Parenthood and provide generally positive coverage when it comes to the pro-choice narrative. These outlets will also provide negative coverage of politicians in states attempting to restrict abortions while doing the opposite for those who want to increase funds for the cause. On the other end, right-wing news outlets are often aligned with the NRA and will promote the pro-gun movement. They will shame politicians who try to limit firearm use and possession and support those who resist such legislation. Now, the third reason as to why every news article is political is because someone is always benefiting from the narrative. When you look deeper into organizations and individuals that manipulate news reporting, we discover that there's always a narrative. It's the story behind the story, and there's always someone who benefits from it. Political gain is the most obvious benefit that one can gain from this, and it usually comes in the form of a policy change or change in political office. It's a relatively straightforward process to ruin a politician's reputation and vote him out, or tarnish the results of a policy to have it repealed. Examples include when conservative media selectively points out the failures of the Affordable Health Care Act in order to help Republicans repeal it, when liberal media selectively covers the impeachment hearings in order to help Democrats oust President Trump from office. The second benefit is less direct in impact. Economic gain, usually in the form of increased profits or damage to their competitor. It's a process that consists of improving the image, reputation, or effects of your policies, or conversely damaging the opponent's policies. Let's look at two examples of this. When the media portrays illegal immigrants in a positive light in order to ease up immigration laws, as such, construction contractors will benefit from a large pool of unskilled labor. And when the media downplays the environmental impacts of the oil industry in order to prevent a carbon tax, whose absence will benefit oil giants. And now finally, the other obscure type of benefit, it's social gain you get from a more favorable view from the public given a particular issue. Examples include marijuana users who benefit greatly from positive coverage from the media. These could be studies showing the medical benefits and studies debunking it being a gateway drug. And on the other side, the recent vaping scandal in the US, which demonstrates the opposite effect. The media focuses on the numerous deaths and health problems caused by vaping impacting its current users. In the end, though, there is no true way to stop the ever-present political activism in news. The process of manipulating information is very easy and effective. The inherent biases are not only part of human nature, but also a key component of the media industry. In addition, any attempt to invoke a reform in the news is far-fetched at best, since the industry is consolidated into powerful conglomerates. Every side of the political spectrum is guilty of creating their own narrative, as we've seen with just a few examples. There is hope, however, because even though we the readers can't change the system, we can learn to deal with it. Identify the narrative conveyed in the text and identify who benefits from such a narrative. Learning how to think for yourself will then make you harder to manipulate.